Hello, everyone. Welcome to De facto. I'm Anthony Ballas, and I am joined today by a very special guest, Dr. Jordan S. Carroll, author of Reading the Obscene, Transgressive Editors and Class Politics of U.S. Literature, which won the MLA Prize for Independent Scholars in 2022. Dr. Carroll's writing has appeared in American Literature, Post 45, The Nation, Polygon, Jacobin, and Los Angeles Review of Books. And his most recent book, the subject of today's conversation, Speculative Whiteness, Science Fiction and the Alt-Right. Dr. Carroll, thank you for joining me and welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I thought we'd begin, Dr. Carroll, with the tweet that kind of brought us together. If you'll indulge me for just a second. This is the tweet that brought us together. It's Elon Musk tweeting about Matt Gaetz, who was making a bid for Attorney General, or at least Trump was nominating him to do so. This was obviously me showing this tweet kind of dates this podcast in a way, because this is already old news in a way, but it's very relevant to our conversation. Apparently, Matt Gaetz, according to Elon Musk, has the attributes needed to clean up the corrupt system in America, and he analogizes those attributes to Judge Dredd, the sci-fi movie from the mid 80s, I believe, starring Sylvester Stallone. And it's kind of interesting in his second line of this tweet. He is the Judge Dredd America needs to clean up a corrupt system and put powerful bad actors in prison. The irony does not get past me that Sylvester Stallone is widely regarded as one of those bad actors in that film. In any case, Dr. Carroll, what are your thoughts on this assessment of Elon Musk's, and why is it relevant to our topic today?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because he really misreads Judge Dredd in a lot of ways. I mean, Judge Dredd starts off at this as this figure in the British comic magazine 2000 AD, which is it's an anthology magazine, but one of the storylines that often appears is a super cop, Judge Dredd, who's based on a kind of hyperbolic version of the things like Dirty Harry from the 1970s. And he's very much like above the law. He is the law. But what Musk misses, as is I think pretty characteristic of his reading habits as well as the far right's reading habits, is the satirical dimension to Judge Dredd. If you look back at the comics, like he will often be summarily executing jaywalkers and stuff like that. It's supposed to be over the top. He's fighting all of these like 70s and 80s punks, and we're supposed to think of him as a bit of like a killjoy, as an authoritarian. His whole costume is actually based on imagery from Francoist Spain, so he's clearly a fascist. But there's also like a Mad Magazine kind of dimension to this. It's just clearly goofy and nothing that anybody would actually invest in. And yet, there is somebody who would identify with the hyperbolic fascist figure in a comic book, or for that matter, the film adaptations of Judge Dredd. And that's somebody like Musk. And so, what my book does is look at a lot of these different misreadings. One of the major threads of the argument is that the far right, and in particular the alt right, I don't know if I would, well, I mean, he's now boasting a Pepe avatar, but I don't know if I would squarely put him in the alt right, but he's clearly making moves in that direction. But what I suggest is that they're often reading these science fiction texts badly, and often using science fiction as a resource for their visions of the future, and missing the satirical dimension, the critical dimension of science fiction. They're identifying often with the bad guys or the figure of fun in science fiction.
Well, thank you for that. And we're going to return a little later to this question of reading habits, because I have a couple of questions on that front. But perhaps for the moment, we should actually go back a step And I'd like to ask you what really inspired you to write this book about science fiction on the alt-right to begin with. What were your inspirations for this text?
There were a few things that happened. One was early on, I had a morbid fascination with Nickland. I went down the rabbit hole of his blog posts. And the thing that interested me most about him as a figure was this idea that, and we'll talk more about this later perhaps, somebody who kind of seemed like me went fascist, like someone who was an academic, who read a lot of cyberpunk, who, was interested in theory. Like, how would somebody with that background ultimately turn to the far right? And that kind of like puzzled me, and I just kept wondering why that was the case. And then I started another kind of project related to the ways that computer programmers and science fiction fans experience time. And so I started thinking a lot about fan culture and geek culture more broadly. And I ended up doing a first, like I can't remember what the order was, but a talk on H.P. Lovecraft and rhythm, um, with some nods to Gertrude Stein. I don't know if that's ever going to see the light of day. And then I did a talk on the Hugo Awards controversy, looking at the blogger Vox Day and the way that he thinks about time. And in particular, the way that he suggests that only white men are capable of writing science fiction because non-white people are uncivilized, quote unquote, in his words, and live only in the present. And so what that triggered for me is a realization that the early kind of morbid curiosity around Nickland was actually really misguided. The idea that a science fiction fan, a nerd like me, could become fascist, I gradually realized like that's not surprising. That's not unusual. I am kind of used to a fan base that is more progressive, if not leftist. The geeks that I've known in my life have mostly been on the left. But what I realized was that there's this long-standing undercurrent of fascist science fiction fans. And then I began pulling at that and exploring that in greater depth.
Hmm. And the Hugo Award controversy and this notion of geek supremacy are two concepts, one event and one concept you tackle in the first chapter of your book, if I remember correctly. Um,
Yeah.
did you want to say more?
Yeah. I mean, so this is a lot. I mean, these are a couple aspects of the book. One is that, yeah, the long-standing idea that geeks are inherently superior to other people. That there's something about an engagement with science fiction that marks you as better than others. And some of this comes from the sense that um, fans are really marginalized. They feel alienated, or at least they did at one moment in history. A lot of this is sort of pre Star Wars, pre current moment when this was a more obscure hobby. And and in some ways, to compensate for this, they imagine that there's something in the character of science fiction fans, and ultimately in some perspectives, that there's something about the genetics about a science fiction fan that makes them superior. So there was a whole movement towards this idea that fans are slans, which is to say, a slan is this kind of superhuman mutant. It's the next step in evolution. And so a lot of fans saw themselves as biologically different from everybody else around them, but in such a way that makes them the dawning of a new future, that they are going to supersede Homo sapiens and become Homo superior or some version of that. Um, and so we can see this thread that goes all the way back to at least as far as the 1930s and 40s, where there's this sense of, on one hand, being put upon and neglected and marginalized. On the other hand, like they don't realize how great we are. The
Mhm.
geeks are really the superior race. And we kind of see that run through all the way to the Hugo Awards controversy, where a blogger like Vox Day is suggesting that you have to have a certain heritage and a certain biologically programmed predisposition to write and appreciate science fiction. And he argued that somebody like N.K. Jemisin, a woman of color and an incredibly successful, both artistically and commercially, science fiction author, wasn't part of the science fiction community. And that's kind of his villain origin story. He says this, I think, in the early 2010s. And then over the years, he builds up his resentments. And then, as a result of this statement, he gets kind of kicked out of the science fiction community. But then he comes back, and along with a group called the Sad Puppies and the Rabid Puppies, he succeeds in getting all these Hugo Awards nominations in that will reflect his taste and the taste of people who are allied with him. This turns out to be ultimately unsuccessful. They get all the nominations because of the way the awards are set up. They can any kind of disciplined slate can sweep the nominations, but they ultimately are rejected by the Hugo Awards community, who in many cases picks no award over the slate that they put in. But we see here like a flashpoint where we think of science fiction fans as, we think of them as loving Octavia Butler and Ursula K. Le Guin, if not of the left, at least vaguely liberal. And yet there's this undercurrent rising up at this moment of history in the mid 20 teens to late 20 teens that is trying to assert a right wing, in some cases conservative, in the case of Vox Day, a fascist science fiction.
Hmm. Now, you mentioned the 2010s, and that's something I want to ask you about in a moment. But backing up just a little bit, you mentioned this figure, Nick Land, and I was going to ask you a question about Nick Land later on, but perhaps I can intervene and uh, ask you right now,
Mhm.
who is Nick Land, and why does he matter in 2025? Or better put, why does he matter to ruminate on in
Yeah.
2025?
Yeah, I mean, he's an odd figure. He started out as someone who's very much influenced by Deleuze and Guattari and Bataille as well. And in the 90s, he was a very edgy academic. Um, and he gradually, I mean, I don't want to speculate about what happened to him, but something happened to him. So there was some kind of break.
Mhm.
Um, and then he resurfaced as this blogger, imagining the most uncompromisingly far-right politics possible. And he, in some ways, advocates for a sort of cosmic Darwinism, where he wants to see a world where like sort of corporate states compete with one another for citizens, but also where populations compete to survive. And he believes that at the end of this process of competition and struggle, um, a new post-human and ultimately post-biological entity will emerge. He's inspired by Terminator here, that there's some being from the future that's gathering its components together and building itself out of capitalism, essentially. And he wants to accelerate capitalism and the destruction of any unity that humanity has, or any community, or any sense of a, redistributive state or a socialist state, to create the strife that will build this being. And I don't know. I don't know why he thinks that that is a good idea. That's always been the normative problem of Nick Land, has always been something interesting. Like, why would it be good to us that a computer would shred our bodies up and turn us into computronium to make something else? But he has this eschatological vision that something more is coming. We have to maximize capitalism so that this will occur. But there's obviously, in addition to this Darwinian dimension, a very racist dimension where he believes that people who supposedly have high IQ are superior and are, as with the science fiction fans of old, he believes that they're the beginnings of the evolution towards the singularity being that's at the end of history. Um, And so he imagines a world in which perhaps particularly white and to some extent East Asian science fiction fans will break away from the rest of humanity, begin a new species, go off into the stars, and build a Dyson sphere that will ultimately create the supercomputer that ends the world. So
Mhm.
the question, I guess, then becomes like, why does this matter? I mean, it's some of it is like it's not clear that I don't think anyone's going to look back at Nickland as like the Thomas Paine of some new ideology that it has mass appeal. Like that's not going to happen. What I think is going to happen, and why somebody like Nickland, or for that matter, his compatriot, his comrade, I guess I should say, maybe Mencius Moldbug, who's another kind of anarcho-capitalist blogger. The reason why any of these people matter, I think, is that I think and we see the influences in a number of places. I think they're going to become a kind of coterie ideology, a kind of rationalization for the elite. Like, I don't think that in 10, 20, 100 years, people are all going to believe this. But I think we're seeing this now that um, a number of people in tech and small, perhaps, but influential number of political figures clearly have some of this stuff in their background, and maybe they don't 100% believe in it, but I think that they've been convinced by this whole ecosystem of right-wing thought that they're not part of the rest of humanity in some sense. They don't owe the surplus populations of the world anything. They don't see people who they consider to be inferior or low IQ as ethical subjects or as citizens that they want to listen to. They really do want to break away and secede from the rest of humanity. And again, I don't think that we're going to get exactly that vision, but what we're going to get is as capitalism continues to collapse and as the ecosystem continues to collapse, these people in key positions of power are going to look at that and watch the tropical zones of this planet become uninhabitable and be like, in the hackneyed phrase of Silicon Valley, that's not a bug, that's a feature. They're just gonna be like, fine. Like most of the people on the planet, they don't think are valuable. Anybody who can't learn to code and anybody who doesn't live within their circle is just material that will eventually be recycled into something better in the computer in their minds.
Mhm.
Or if they don't hold that vision, they at least hold them in enough contempt that they're not worried about them in any sense.
I really appreciate that analysis. It helps us explain what was perhaps inevitable as of the last couple of weeks, the um, willful capitulation of Silicon Valley to the MAGA movement almost seamlessly. So I appreciate that analysis. Maybe we should talk a little bit about the 2010s and what you see in your analysis, what you saw happening in the 2010s. This sort of precipitated this rise in the alt-right and this alt-right sci-fi that you diagnose.
I think it's really overdetermined. But I think a big component of it is we have all these right-wing people. But I think what happened was the mainstream conservative movement, in some ways, revealed itself to be um, insufficient and undesirable to them. So if we kind of back up a little bit, we have in the Bush administration, we have the war on terror, which in some ways discredits neoconservatism as we see the failures in Afghanistan and Iraq. We have the financial crisis, which in some ways discredits neoliberalism, um, revealing the inefficiency and destructive nature of capitalism. And we also have a generation of conservatives, I think, who are less interested in a evangelical Christianity of a Protestant variety. And so I think what happened was we have this rising generation at the time it was millennial, now it's increasingly, I guess, Gen Z, perhaps, people with right-wing views who felt disaffected with the mainstream GOP, and in particular with the kind of universalist vision that the GOP was presenting, if not as its practice, as its ideology, a vision of the world in which everybody would be incorporated into the same global system of, free markets, free societies, free Bibles, all imposed at the barrel of a gun or IMF, restrictions or through whatever means. And, a lot of people in the world would end up in that vision as, junior partners in this, subordinates, maybe incarcerated. But it was supposed to be an all-encompassing system that the conservatives were trying to create. There are always tensions within this. You can find plenty of people who are affiliated with the Bush administration in one way or another, advancing the most unregenerate biological and cultural racism. But at least at some level, there was an idea of a compassionate vision where everybody is locked into the system, and that seemed to fail. Like it didn't work. Iraq did not turn into the flourishing liberal democracy we were told it was going to. The markets didn't buoy everybody up, and so we have this group of young right-wing white men who are mad, who feel as if they didn't get the future they were promised. And they were, in some ways, trained and prepared for a better future. And then everything falls apart in their lives, partly due to the economic systems crises, partly due to the massive personality flaws and particular biographical troubles that many of these people have. Um, but I think they held on to a vision of hierarchy and necessary inequality in their mind, but they weren't going to subscribe to a compassionate conservatism or a globalist vision of the world. Instead, they wanted a world in which they could rise to the top and everybody else could be jettisoned, ultimately exterminated. And I think that's where the alt-right comes out as a kind of mutation from a mainstream conservatism that had shown itself to be bankrupt. Um, and obviously, they could have gone in another direction. They could, many people had the same experience of watching the failures of the 2000s and watching the financial crisis and broke left. But this was a group of people who went further and further to the right. The system's not right wing enough. It's not, first, often it was not capitalist enough. And then eventually it's just, it's not authoritarian enough. It's not hierarchical enough. Ultimately, it's not racist enough.
I'm largely convinced by that political assessment that diagnoses not only the 2010s post 2008 crisis, but really catapults us into our present predicament regarding well, in the next few days here, the second installment of the Trump administration. Um, you employ a term in your first chapter, if I think first chapter, perhaps in the introduction as well, metapolitics. And I'm curious if you could explain to our audience your usage of this term metapolitics and what it has to do with speculative whiteness.
Yeah, I think metapolitics is in some ways one of the major features that separates the alt-right from just white nationalism, white power, neo-Nazism. Obviously, there's a lot of continuity there, but in terms of political strategy, one of the things that the alt-right does that other forms of um, uh, radical white supremacist ideology doesn't necessarily always follow is this idea of metapolitics, which is to say the idea that politics is a consequence of pre-political attitudes that are rooted in culture. And so people on the alt-right got this idea from the French New Right. And what they believed in was instead of advocating for particular policies or a certain program, instead they should try to do, what people used to call culture jamming or to do a kind of right-wing Gramscianism, where they would change the common sense and change the culture, change the way that in particular white people think, in order to make fascism um, not only appealing but seemingly inevitable. But one of the things that I find is that this isn't just another way of doing culture war. There's something more fundamental here. For them, metapolitics is not just changing, I don't know, how you feel about multiculturalism. It's changing how you feel about the way reality works, the way time works, the way the world works. In some ways, metapolitics is a metaphysics or a political ontology. They want to change the way people think at the fundamental level. And a big part of that is changing what people think of as possible. They want to make white people imagine themselves as full of potential, full of possibility. They want white people, in effect, to think of themselves as owning the future. Referencing Cabaret, Richard Spencer would say, tomorrow belongs to me or tomorrow belongs to us. They really believe this. They think that only they will inhabit the future, only they are capable of imagining the future. And they also think, conversely, non-white people, and really anybody they think of as their racial enemy, are incapable of possibility, incapable of imagining alternatives, incapable of inhabiting the future. They want to convince white people that non-white people exist either in an kind of impulsive present, a reactive present that is not interested in long-term planning, or they want white people to believe that non-white people exist in the past as a throwback, as something that is being superseded by the master race, which is someday, in the minds of at least some of the alt-right and other white nationalists, will evolve into something even more, something post-human, and then basically it's spread to the stars.
Right. No, that's very interesting. That term metapolitics gives you a lot of conceptual sort of ground to work out that political ontology. I found it very fascinating in your book. You also do a lot of historical work in this text, and late in the book, you claim it's actually a kind of historical study for a couple reasons. One, that we're kind of at the end of the alt-right movement, which has morphed and evolved into something new, and perhaps we can talk about that
Yeah, yeah.
in a moment. But you also make this very interesting claim in your book, which is that science fiction has itself never been innocent of fascism. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that for our audience.
Yeah, I mean, we often think about events like the Hugo Awards and other kinds of right-wing cultural events like Gamergate as something new. These are some outside agitators who have entered into science fiction or fan culture more broadly. And this is a product of image boards from the last 20 years, or this is something a backlash against something that occurred recently. But that's actually not the case. The only reason we think of science fiction as, if not inherently, at least tendentially leftist, is the result of a hard-won struggle to determine how we read science fiction. And I mean this as critics, as academics, and as fans, have created our own canon where science fiction is Samuel Delaney and Ted Chiang and Kim Stanley Robinson. But really, like, there's been a long-term tendency in science fiction towards the right. Obviously, there have been plenty of right-wing figures in science fiction. But the thing that surprised me was at the earliest period of science fiction fan culture in the 1940s. Um, we see, or at least the tail end of the earliest period, I guess we can call it, we see the emergence of a figure like James H. Madol, who was the leader of the first um, neo-Nazi party, or at least the first significant neo-Nazi party in the United States. And he comes out of fan culture. He even uh, sends a notice to a science fiction magazine to try to recruit people to one of his earlier projects. And he's very much drawing on science fiction imagery. He imagines that he is um, building a new Atlantis, a place where a kind of cognitive elite are going to rule using high technology. They're going to evolve into something more. And this is all going to be predicated on extermination of non-white populations. And so he believed that the science fiction future can only be built through fascism and through genocide. But we see this again and again, where there's this undercurrent, often fought back. And I should emphasize that, like, the argument is not that science fiction is all fascist. We see even in Madol's day, um, fans ridiculing him or rejecting him. But it's still there, and we can't think of this as something that is alien and an invasion of science fiction by some outside force, but as um, part of its history, a part of its genealogy. And we have to think of science fiction not as uh, inherently leftist, but as a struggle where the left has won out, but that isn't always going to be the case if we don't keep fighting, essentially.
Yeah, I really, really like that. And I like that part in the book when you're describing these fascist roots, you could say, in the genre. And part of that struggle that you're describing is kind of played out in terms of reading strategies, which you've already sort of mentioned. And I was particularly compelled in this book by your argument about the subjunctive and modal features of speculative whiteness. I was wondering if you could discuss those and also what you mean by the following, or meant or mean by the following sentence, that the alt-right has interpreted science fiction to say that a fascist world is possible. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And then also, I'm very curious about these reading protocols that you write about, that the alt-right has embraced, and how, quote, the right ignores irony, parody, and imminent critique in science fiction texts through a hermeneutics of obtuseness. Any thoughts on any and all the above, hopefully?
Yeah, and one of the things that I argue is that what I call speculative whiteness, this idea that only white people are capable of imagining the future, and therefore only white people are in science fiction, or only white people belong in science fiction, I guess I should say. Part of this is a kind of myth of what I call modal impoverishment, the idea that um, people who aren't a part of this white male elite don't have imagination and don't open out onto new possibilities. And so part of this is an idea that whiteness is not something actual. It's not something that exists in the present. There's a promissory dimension to whiteness that can only be fulfilled at some future time. And so the argument is that whiteness itself is speculative, and we can see how this is pretty convenient for the alt-right because in many cases, they're praising their great heroes in history. They're claiming all of European culture and technology and all of its achievements, whether dubious or real. And yet, in many cases, these are people who can't do much of anything. Often, it seems like who have done very little in their lives, but they can say, um, if it weren't for the multicultural, multiracial society of the present, I would be an astronaut conquering the stars or something like that. And they talk in these terms directly at times. Um, in order to, in some ways, put clothes on that fantasy and to fill it out, they often turn to science fiction texts, and as you point out, they will engage in this hermeneutics of obtuseness, a kind of it's not always clear if they know that they're misreading it. In some cases, they are very self-conscious about it, um, and enjoying the transgressive nature of the reading. But the idea is that as I suggested, science fiction is a struggle. And that means that often science fiction texts have a kind of sediment or record of that struggle. So that, for example, we often see in science fiction, the specter of fascism is kind of summoned up only to banish it. In texts like Norman Spinrad's The Iron Dream, the Paul Verhoeven version of Starship Troopers, um, Alan Moore's Watchmen. We have all these texts in the history of science fiction that are designed in order to elicit fascist desire in order to critique it. So we see the exterminationist hero, we see the kind of Ubermensch figure, um, and then we have a moment, or at least the imagined audience has a moment. Maybe not everybody has this feeling, where we kind of feel a moment of excitement surrounding that figure, um, and then we pull back and feel disgust. Or in some cases, if that isn't enacted in the text, we still think back to moments that are very much analogous to that, where we read the pulp science fiction novel about the hero and felt a thrill as they destroyed their enemies, who were subhuman foes. And the point is then to say, like, to realize the problematic nature of that and to move beyond it and to recognize that fascism is not always something over there. We have to kind of kill the fascists in our heads and kill the fascists in our fandom, by grappling with it in these texts. The thing is, though, there's a really easy, it seems like, way of getting around that, which is to um, leave off that last part. There's a kind of foreshortening of these texts where Richard Spencer will watch the Khan episode of Star Trek where the eugenics Ubermensch appears and he's this powerful figure played by Ricardo Montalban. Spencer doesn't think about the kind of racial dimension of this. He glosses over that, but we're supposed to think like, okay, this is the Khan in any other science fiction text would be the hero. He would be, um, in some ways, he's a little bit like Paul Atreides. Like he would be the figure that is going to change the universe. He's powerful. He's dominant. But in Star Trek, like not supposed to identify him with him. We're supposed to identify with Spock. And so, Spencer then says, no, Spock represents Jewish Marxism. I identify with Khan. He's the winner. And so they do that again and again and again. We see this as well with like Frank Herbert's Dune, which an ambiguous text in a lot of ways. But at least one of the things that Herbert did, it's debatable whether he succeeded, was the goal of making this Paul Atreides this sort of superhuman God Emperor, and then showing us how this is actually authoritarian. They do the same thing. They ignore that moment where um, we realize that all along we've been, part of the party of the devil. We've been seduced by sin, and we need to now like try to purge ourselves of this vanished desire to have great heroes who are somehow genetically superior, dominate the world, recreate utopia through mass death. And we're supposed to back away from that. But the alt-right will say, no, no, no. Um, we identify with the supervillains. We identify with the anti-heroes. We identify with the figure of fascism that is um, just underneath the surface of science fiction texts, even if it's only trying to be buried by an ostensibly progressive author.
Hmm. That was very interesting. You kind of forecasted my next couple of questions, actually, and so feel free to skip over these next questions, if you please. I was curious how you consider sort of these racist ideologies becoming suffused in the sci-fi narratives, and you've kind of broached that a bit in your previous question. And also, you've just I had a question about figures like Spencer, who you write about in this book, obviously, and Elon Musk, who you've already commented on, and how they've adopted certain narratives, not only like for instance, in Spencer's misreading or let's say creative rereading of Star Trek, but I wonder if you have any other examples of how they've adopted these narratives and put them into practice.
I mean, I think what we're seeing is, in some ways, with um, in recent years with figures of Musk and Spencer, I think we're seeing a kind of two sides to this, and this is something I don't really develop in the book, but I feel like we're seeing, um, in some ways, two strains of speculative whiteness, or two streams of fascism. And maybe I'll talk about Spencer first because he's unfortunately, well, I don't want to spend time with either of them, but he's the one that I've spent the most time with. Um, I mean, Spencer is in some ways like, I think he's best understood as like an evil aesthete. Like he has this very, and Benjamin, an aestheticized version of politics. But it is very much about like style and fashion. I mean, in some ways, as wrong as the journalists were when they described, oh, this clean cut fascist, like that's a central part of his identity. And he really does want a kind of aestheticized vision of the world where there will be mass suffering and domination and pain. But he wants to kind of sit back and enjoy that and turn that into a spectacle. And I think that, he often turns to film, sometimes books as well. He did a podcast on Frank Herbert's Doom, but often film, as a way of articulating that. And so, he wants, for example, the Terminator, this sort of white, cold Austrian coded figure in the form of Arnold Schwarzenegger, to come back from the future and dominate the world. Or he wants a world in which white men are going to go off into space, but what's important to him is less like, oh, we're going to learn so much about space. It's more, he likes this idea of risk and death. He likes the idea that white men are going to, in his words, die exploring the moons of Jupiter. And he wants a kind of beautiful death, I think. Now, other than getting punched, it's not clear how much he's exposing himself to this. He is not fresh out of the trenches of the Great War. But he's channeling this kind of interwar fascist ideal of, liberalism is about individuality and self-satisfaction and material comforts, and therefore is emasculating and feminizing and weakening. And fascism is about strength, and so and beauty and becoming. He's often identifying with Apollo now. And he wants to become this sort of, or at least wants white men to become this beautiful, perfect figure, chiseled, going out into space and proving that they don't care about their lives. They don't care about their feelings and comforts. They're going to build something for the race. They're going to have a greater destiny and rise above it. And it's going to be, again, like this wonderful spectacle, that I think he kind of envisions as the future. So that's one version, I think, of speculative whiteness that I talk about in the book. It's a kind of romanticizing version, one that I think of as like the warm stream of fascism, where it's about, listening to Wagner, and having a kind of like organic community, and appreciating white marble busts, and so on. I should note that, like, I mean, all these people, like, they'll quote they'll quote German figures and so on, but often, again, they often have like a superficial understanding of all of this. Um, Especially the people that Spencer associates with. You can tell that he's the one that's gone to grad school, and some of these people haven't. But nevertheless, like that's the vision. That white people are great because they produce great art and they will have beautiful deaths. Musk, I don't think is interested in that. I don't think that that's what he represents. Um, I think that there is another version of speculative whiteness that is now morphing into something more like a speculative eugenics, and it's a kind of racialized meritocracy where the goal is not necessarily to like lift up an organic community, but to allow the people who supposedly have the highest IQs to rise to the top through economic competition, and demonstrate their greatness through yeah, economic and technical performance. And we kind of saw that with the debate around visas, where one side is um, nativist, America first, keep the foreigners out. The other side is we need the best and the brightest from other countries to come here and become productive citizens. And that's another thing I think that's central to this, what I might call the cold stream of fascism, a productivism. The late David Glemia kind of talks about this in cyber libertarianism as well. I briefly touch on it in my book. Um, a sense that the genetically superior people are not the bureaucrats and the bankers or the welfare recipients, but the people in society that are supposed to be the most economically productive. And at one point, this was a vision of um, the salt of the earth, peasants or farmers, and the industrial capitalists. But increasingly, this is a vision of productivism surrounding people who are productive in the tech fields and who are supposedly innovating in those areas. So I think that for Musk, and he's often hard to read because he's not always a coherent figure in terms of his ideology. I mean, I think that's what he wants is a world in which the people who demonstrate that they can code or run a business will have the most babies. Here, eugenics is a central aspect. He's worried about quote unquote idiocracy. He's worried about the fact that supposedly low IQ people are breeding faster than high IQ people. But he wants to maximize the genetic output of high IQ people with an eye towards ultimately expanding that population to Mars. And so part of his Martian fantasy, and it's important to stress that this is a fantasy. I don't need to go through the scientific and technical reasons why this will not happen in the next century, if not ever. Um, but the part of this Martian fantasy is that space is going to solve the problem of basically Lebensraum for high IQ people. And this is one of the things that I saw in my book too, is um, that space is very appealing for the right. It's a place of, there's no indigenous population. It's a place where the colonizer can expand in Spencer's mind, um, and without any kind of interference. It's a place for white self-expression, a place where white people can demonstrate their excellence without being held back by their racial enemies. For Musk, though, it seems like it is very much about maximizing population numbers. It's a crude way of thinking about the world. More people is better, more people, more productive, and in particular, more people who can run a company while gaming and tweeting 12 hours a day at the same time. That's the future is making sure that the offspring of Musk extends into the billions and trillions in this long-term vision of what's to come.
Sort of celestial Genghis Khan or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
And I can't help but think what came to mind when you were describing the warm stream of Richard Spencer's variety of the billionaire bioengineering hacking guy Bryan Johnson, I think is his name,
Mhm.
who is not only trying to don this, chiseled, youthful appearance for the remainder of his overly extended life, but also becoming one of those very white busts that you
Yeah.
described, you know.
Yeah. It's strange. Like, and it's worth noting that at one point, Spencer thought of himself as a Dionysian, or at least um, wanted to bring those two Nietzschean poles together. But
Mm,
yeah, I mean, the busts are interesting, and I think it's indicative in some ways. I mean, one, again, like the aestheticized politics.
right.
But the other is that like these are figures that are, etched in stone, they never change. And so part of it, I wonder if this obsession with the white bust is not only a anachronistic admiration of their whiteness. Obviously, as many classicists will tell you, they used to be many colors, but also the idea of like becoming this thing that is perfect but doesn't change in any way, that remains ever youthful and doesn't have to suffer time. And I think that's part, in some ways, points to speculative whiteness's fundamental contradiction. Is it's like, I promise that the future will hold post-human mutants and spaceships, but also the racial hierarchies of a certain moment in history will just never change. Like it's a kind of radical change that is also somehow combined with a fundamental stasis and an inability to think historically.
hmm You in the book in the second chapter, towards the end, you draw out this genealogy from Nietzsche to Heidegger and so forth. We might even pick up now a genealogy back to Hegel and his reverence of the Greek busts, the Greek statuary, and then thus further back to the firmament of Western civilization itself.
Mhm.
Very interesting. And my quotes for people listening on Spotify, I'm putting those terms in quotes when I say them. Um, I'm curious on some of these other phenomena that are not directly related, but they're perhaps loosely related or might be somewhat tangential. But I'm just curious. We live in a renewed age of conspiracy. This is not the first age of conspiracy that the United States has found itself mired in. Phenomena like QAnon, for instance. We have this really just dramatic rise in the UFO sort of narrative that's just clogging up every news station relentlessly for at least the last few years. And I'm just curious if you have any insights on conspiracy in general, or the ones I just mentioned in particular, and perhaps why they've reemerged so vociferously in our present era. If you have any thoughts you might want to contribute.
I mean, I think there are a variety of reasons. I've written about the ways in which it feels like um, the dominant ideologies, the dominant hegemony is kind of slipping and disintegrating. Um, and I think that people are trying to come up with something else to make sense of the world. But in terms of the relationship between QAnon and speculative whiteness and science fiction, um, I think in some ways it's a bit like, and maybe I'm misremembering this quote, the William Gibson quote that, the future is already here, but it's unevenly distributed. I think there's a sense in which the people invested in these conspiracy theories imagined that the world was going to be better. They wanted the future. You have the Peter Thiels of the world who are like, "Where's my flying car?" I don't know if I don't consider him a conspiracy theorist, but that's the same sentiment with QAnon. There's a sense of like, I thought there would be more, um, and coming along with that is a sense of, well, that future was stolen by somebody. Alex Jones will tell his fans, you should be out exploring the world. You should be, like Magellan. You should be uh, going out into the stars. You had this great potential, but the globalists are keeping you stunted. They're keeping you in your place. They're pinning you down to wherever you are right now, whatever your life circumstances are, and thwarting your self-actualization and a vision of a better future. And we see this a lot, I think, in QAnon, where it's this internet-based conspiracy theory that emerged around the time of Trump that suggested that the reason the wonderful "Make America Great Again" slogan never actually came to fruition, we never actually became great, was that the deep state and the globalist elite were working behind the scenes in order to try to stop Donald Trump. And he, in turn, was in the process of preparing to storm a series of um, public executions or otherwise some kind of retribution against these nefarious figures who were preventing him from returning us to the glory days of an idealized version of America in the 1950s or whatever. Um, but as part of this conspiracy, there's often this idea that like the high tech is somewhere. Like there's a med bed that's gonna cure all of my diseases, and it's hidden in underneath the ground in a secret cavern that like only George Soros has access to. The technology I was promised and the vitality I was promised, and we could go back to Dr. Strangelove. They're sapping and impurifying our precious bodily fluids. The thing I thought I was going to feel, my youth, is gone, but someone has stolen it, and it's the globalists. And the here we should I mean, it's this is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory on some level, at least structurally, if not explicitly. They're sucking our vitality and draining it from us. And how are they doing that? Part of it is chemtrails and all these other wild theories that, the reason you feel middle-aged right now is that there's something in the sky that makes you feel middle-aged. It's making you tired. But it's also there, and this is getting back to the blood libel myth, that they are literally devouring our future in the form of babies. Or children. They're sucking the adrenochrome out of the children, the life out of the children, so that these um, they pretty Jewish coded vampires can live. They are taking the future from the red-blooded American patriots of the world. And so I think that this is kind of a sense of exhaustion, disappointment. There's no future ahead of us that we can see. I don't know if they are really worried about climate change since they don't believe in that, but they do see that like the world that they were promised never came to fruition. In some cases, these are people who are experiencing massive levels of debt and downward mobility. So this is, I think, a multi-generational experience of doing worse off than one's parents, or at least than one was promised. And they need some explanation, and it's that the future is being kept underground by a small number of nefarious actors who want to contain the rest of the population and enjoy the future for themselves. Um, so yeah, I think that is a lot of it. And there are other factors. There's the digital media that kind of feeds into all of this. The disintegration of meta narratives that made sense of the world, um, an overriding sense of distrust. And then, it's worth also adding the fact that we do live in a world where the government does a lot of stuff in secret, and there's no way of us really knowing what is happening often. And that, I think, drives people to paranoia. There are plenty of horrible things that the government is actually doing. And if you peer beneath the surface, you see the real atrocities that are being committed. But I think that the fact that we live in a world where so much of the decision making happens behind closed doors also leads people to these wild theories.
I appreciate that assessment quite a bit. In particular, that the economic analysis that you give to kind of root where these fantasies and conspiracies sort of arise. It's fascinating.
Yeah, can I add one thing to that?
Of course.
I think so, I mean, in some ways, this is what links somebody like Musk to the person who is like, deep in debt or underemployed. Um, one of the things that I noticed when Trump won was immediately Musk retweets something about um, the corporate rate of profits and
Mhm.
suggesting that they should the trend line should be going up, and then it gets pushed down by the overwhelming state regulations that have been put in place. And so we see this on the macro level. Like individuals are like, I thought I'd have a house. I thought
Mhm.
I'd have health care. I thought I would have the job that my parents had. I didn't get that. And then identify with someone like Musk because he has the same level of grievance. Like, I thought that I would be even more rich at this point. I thought the economy would be even bigger and growing at an even faster rate. And obviously, the thing that like binds those together is not that a shadowy group of multiculturalists and globalists have stolen all of that. It's like we're in the long downturn and we're in the midst of an ongoing crisis of capitalism that impacts people on the individual level, but also at the level of the entire system.
Mhm. If only Trump and Musk knew that the fall of the rate of profit and the immiseration and pauperization of the worker were umbilically linked.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that like, and this we can talk about this in a second. I think this gets to another question, but like in some ways, like the antidote to all this is like historical materialism, like is structural thinking, not thinking in biological essences, but thinking at the level of the system and how it shapes our lives in ways that no one can control. And I guess that's another thing that QAnon can't countenance. Like
Mhm.
the system is immiserating us, not because there's an individual or a group behind the scenes deciding that, we want everyone to eat bugs and we want everyone to be humiliated. It's the system itself um is dealing with irresolvable contradictions.
Mhm. Yeah, well put. And of course, I fully agree. I have two more questions if you have time.
Sure, yeah, yeah.
Um, Back to the earlier question and your response on the reading protocols. I'm curious what kinds of reading protocols or what we might do to combat the rise of these tendencies that you've diagnosed. Um, are there reading strategies, interpretive strategies we might employ? But also, are there certain forms of sci-fi that maybe lend themselves more readily or easily to these kinds of um, historical materials, let's say, interpretations that you've identified?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways it's a difficult question. As long as we live in a society dominated by racial capitalism, there's going to be that possibility that any cultural production gets co-opted. Um, there's very little that can't be pulled to the right under those circumstances. Even the outward trappings of a certain version of Marxism get in weird corners of the internet get pulled into the right with fantasies of red brown alliances and MAGA communism and so on. Um, but I think we in some ways science fiction culture has done a great job of and there's obviously still more work to do, but bringing in more diverse voices, ensuring that science fiction is not dominated by a select few white men. Um, at the same time, I feel like one of the things that I think would be would contribute even further to the struggle against fascism in science fiction would be rethinking the narrative structures that are left over from the past. Because I feel like we're at a moment where, there's so much great diverse science fiction, um, but there's, I think, a danger of keeping alive things like the vision of the great hero who is exceptional, who has infinite potential, and individually changes the world, or the idea, the not sorry, not the ideal, the idea that evil comes from the outside. It's an essence that infects a previously harmonious system, and it just has to be exterminated. Um, Obviously, like those narrative structures can do a lot of different ideological work, but I feel like they leave the door open to fascist readings or misreadings. And so I think that the next step is not just to have a science fiction where everyone feels included, but one where we're more critical and thoughtful about the genre's history and refuse types of narratives that are going to potentially be co-opted by the right. Um, and I think for me, I mean, the science fiction that I like um, is very much uh, science fiction that is, yeah, anti-heroic, that has a vision of history that's not about exceptional individuals with inborn powers, but is about the ways that larger structures shift over time. Um, but also, science fiction I like is about the idea that the future is not just going to be us with cooler gadgets. And I think that authors who do this would include somebody like Samuel Delany. I feel like this is in some ways like the core of Trouble on Triton, which is, I think, one of my top favorite science fiction books. I mean, we see this in another one of my science fiction books in a negative light. Peter Watts's Blind Sight. Maybe not a utopian vision of the future, but I think a novel of radical change, and this is one in which consciousness itself turns out to be an evolutionary bottleneck, and and sort of sentient but non-conscious beings come to dominate. They don't have an experience of themselves, but they're super intelligent. Obviously, not the vision of the future that I want, but it points to the way that science fiction can show us how there are genuine ruptures ahead of us. Things will genuinely change, and it's not just going to be a wish fulfillment fantasy where we all show up in the future with ray guns. Another author that I really love, though, is um, Olaf Stapledon, Last and First Men, and Star Maker. These are the first book is sort of a biography of humanity in the future and post-humanity, and the second one is the entire cosmos. And what we see in this is there's no, there are very few individual characters. It's like the sweep of these giant shifts in history, and it would be like, and that is when all humans became extinct and a new kind of species emerged, and it was a giant brain computer or whatever, and then that died off, and then a new thing emerged. And it just gives you the sense that the forward sweep of history is going to be ideally one that is organized around a kind of, in Stapleton's words, community with a capital C. And he doesn't necessarily mean a kind of touchy-feely community, but a sense of um, a shared intellectual and cultural and political project that brings everyone together to make the world better. Um, but it's going to be one where it's not just a recapitulation of what came before. It's going to be one where there are genuine and often radical changes. And so I think that's what science fiction needs to ideally embraced. I think there are other kinds of anti-fascist strategies. Not everybody has to do the kind of Jamesonian rupture with the present vision of the future. We can imagine some of the more playful and ironic ways of thinking about science fiction could also do this by deflating the heroic mode. But for me, what's really appealing about science fiction is the idea that what's going on right now is impermanent and the future could be exciting. It could be utopian, um, but it's not one in which we will simply see the coming to fruition of the even the needs and desires that we currently have. They're going to develop new needs and desires and be something different. Um, and that can be beautiful. That can be wonderful and sublime, and a kind of adventure that we should look forward to.
Well, thank you very much for that rumination and those endorsements for some of those other alternative sci-fi thematics that you've outlined. My final question, Dr. Carroll, uh, is actually what is next on the horizon for you work-wise? I've heard a rumor that you're perhaps working on another book.
Uh, I mean, I've fantasized about another book. I have not started on anything like that. I'm kind of in an odd place where I'm figuring out what's next. Um, you know, there are plenty of things that interest me right now. To be honest, I kind of after I finished the book, I was like, I'm gonna read Homer and I'm gonna read the political economy of like the ancient medieval world, like all this stuff that has nothing to do with the troubles of the present. I mean, yeah, it does, I guess, in some respects. Everything has something to do with the troubles of the present, but something that's very far removed from um, the the world post 1900. I've also been writing fiction, and that's in some ways where this other reading has come into play. I have a short story forthcoming from Kaleidotrope, but I've been writing a series of fantasy stories that, again, very far removed from speculative whiteness, but are playing with these ideas of how can we think structurally in fiction and think at the level of the political economy. We'll see if any of that ever ever comes out, but it's kind of what I've been working on. I have other projects that are not ready to maybe being announced. That might be one of them that you're thinking of. Um, but
Not trying to put
right
you
now
on the spot.
it's
So,
what's that?
not trying to put you on the spot. I understand.
Yeah. Um, but right now, yeah, I'm kind of just sort of enjoying a life in which I don't have to read alt-right screeds over and over every single day.
In fact, that was a question I had that I ultimately deleted, which was how did you deal with the pain of reading some of these alt-right internet archives essentially that you
Yeah, I mean it's miserable. In some ways, like the ones that are the worst were easier to steel myself against. Like if you're just like reading uh like frothing neo-Nazi, um, you can kind of okay, that's what this is gonna be. The worst moments are listening to an all right podcast where at the beginning they're chatting about Todorowsky's Dune and talking about their favorite movies, and then you're blindsided by something horrifically racist
Mm,
and despicable. Because at that moment, and I think this is why they do these podcasts. There's a moment of like, oh, like I could imagine this sounds like any old conversation, and then they insert the ideological message, and then it's just sort of disgusting. Those were in some ways the hardest to listen to, um, because you weren't always ready for it. I
mm.
don't know. I mean, yeah, part of me is like, yeah, this could be another book. But it's just so hard to get through. And part of me is like, there's so many. wonderful works of theory and literature that I could be reading if I weren't reading these vile anti-Semitic, racist, and fascist tracts.
Well, we appreciate you doing so to produce this book so that we, your readers, don't didn't have to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Um,
I should say, don't, um, the don't click on a bunch of links for some of this stuff. Read it on the web archive if you can. These get monetized. Don't buy from fascist publishers as much as possible. If you need to access this stuff, well, one, you probably could have better things to do with your life. But two, like, um, yeah, don't access it in a way that might put money in the pockets of these people.
I appreciate that emphasis. Dr. Carroll, thank you so much for joining us. Look forward to having you on again at some point. And when and if your stories and any other writings come up, please do send them. And I will
Sure.
not only um, put them in the description box of this episode, but perhaps we can even have another conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Yeah, it was a pleasure.